My name is Bryn Rhodes. I'm Chief Technology Officer for Alphora, aka DCG. I'm also a co-chair of the Clinical Decision Support Workgroup in HL7, which actually stewards the CDS Hook standards, and I'm a standards editor for several HL7 standards. So learning objectives. Hopefully, by the end of this, you'll understand the design and capabilities of CDS hooks. Oh, there it goes. Okay. And I should say yes to that so that that isn't in the way, right? Good. All right. Demonstrate how CDS hooks. Now I'm getting some. I don't know. A little bit. Okay. And does that sound echoey to anybody else but me? That sounds pretty echoey, right? There's some kind of feedback loop going on. My sound isn't in. Is this? We shut the wrong thing. Maybe I should mute my computer mic or my computer speaker.
How about now?
Oh yeah, that sounds better.
Lovely.
Okay, and the feedback's back. All right, we'll just turn that way and we're good. Okay. So the bilirubin chart works with newborns that are less than 120 hours old. It's the only time that this application is used, and it's looking for results that are either not documented or outside of the accepted range. But no, that was too many. Go back. So the user needs to know the app's available. They need to know this bilirubin app is out there, something that they can use. They need to know that it's relevant to their particular time frame. And assuming they know all that, they have to actually go find the app and launch it. And so that's interruptive to the workflow and doesn't really. So CDS Hooks is addressing that problem. It's originated from the same team that built Smart. It is open source via Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 license, and it's a published HL7 standard. It's available at cdshooks.hl7.org. So CDS hooks defines a CDS service as a service that is invoked via a hook. So some event in the workflow, that's a common pattern, evaluates its own logic using FHIR data, and it returns decision support via cards. So it's important that the service to CDS hooks is a black box. It doesn't care what goes on inside that. It could be anything. It could be a workflow engine. It could be AI. It could be a mechanical Turk or a Ouija board. So a CDS client then is a CPOE or an EHR or other clinical workflow system that invokes a CDS service via a hook, consumes the decision support, and may provide smart authorization and a FHIR server. So a typical CDS hooks interaction, you can imagine a provider that's ordering a medication, Toprol-XL, for example. The client triggers a CDS hook that invokes a remote service. So any service that the client's aware of that's registered to that hook, the client makes the call to that service. The service then runs its own rules leveraging FHIR data as needed. We'll look at how that happens. The service then returns CDS cards, and those are rendered and displayed by the client. It's up to the client to decide how to render those cards. It might be an information card, something that says $45 a month, patient pays $7. A suggestion card to actually switch a medication, for example, try HCTZ due to patient age, or maybe an actual link to a smart application. So you could actually launch the smart app from that point. So digging into that a little deeper, the CDS client invokes the CDS service using the endpoint CDS services example service in this case. So the request says what hook we're invoking and passes a FHIR server along with some context information, what users in context, what patient encounter, and that's the information the CDS client sends to the CDS service. CDS service then runs its logic and returns a CDS card. So a summary card in this case, example, an indicator of info. We'll look at those in a bit more detail. That's the basic interaction. So here's an example medication alert. You can see the source. The client renders that card. Someone's drawing on my CDS service can return any number of cards. The client renders each card. So that's important. The client has control over what that rendering looks like. Each card has a concise summary, an indicator noting the importance, information on the organization or the data set. That's the source of the card's data. And it can be any combination of information, suggestions, and links. So some of the hooks that are available, so there's patient view. This is the most widely used and implemented hook. Patient view patient view hook fires when a patient's chart is opened, optionally within the context of an encounter. There's also order select. Order select hook fires when a clinician selects one or more orders to place for a patient. So the context of this hook may include defaulted order details, but CDS services should expect some of that information to not yet be specified. And this one is deprecating the medication prescribed hook. There's order sign. The order sign hook fires when a clinician is ready to sign one or more orders. So this contains all the order details, but it hasn't yet been finalized. So use this hook when your service requires all order details, and the clinician will accept recommended changes. This hook replaces the medication prescribe and order review hooks. All right, so the way that new hooks are proposed, because obviously the patient view and order select and order sign are only a few of the workflow points that we'd like to be able to interact with. So CDS hooks defines a hook maturity model. It's similar to the FHIR maturity model. It's a process for the community to propose and implement new hooks. So that whole process is described in that hook maturity model link, but we basically submit a new proposal for a hook as a draft update to the specification. And then that hook is discussed and potentially approved, and then goes through a balloting process with HL7 before it's finally STU and or normative. Why did it go backwards? There. So the way that whole process works, this is the same for the standard itself. So there's a specification publication. The CI build is on cdshooks.org. So if you look at the tree on the left-hand side, that's the left-hand view in the cdshooks.org. The specification itself in current draft is published there. So what's currently available on GitHub, CDS Hooks docs. That's the latest build. It's constantly changing as we make changes and apply those. What's actually published on hl7.org is ballot and release content. So as you propose a hook, it shows up in the hooks list over here on the left. That's discussed and refined and then balloted and reconciled. And once it's published, it actually shows up in the hooks on the published site. And those, as we publish more, we'll have multiple releases. The point is that the hook definitions are independent from the specification itself. So we don't have to release a whole new CDS hook specification to release new hooks. All right. So next, how do we get data as a CDS service? What access mechanisms are available to us? So the CDS client can provide context data through a push, so information that it has as part of the workflow, things like the user ID and the patient ID. There could also be prefetch data, where the service has indicated that it requires some additional information and asks the client to provide that as part of the request. Or it can retrieve FHIR data if the CDS client provides a FHIR endpoint to the service. So there are cases for each of those. Hook context data is specific to the hook. So when you define a hook, you also specify the context information that's associated with it. So patient view, for example, has user ID, the patient ID, encounter ID. Those are defined by the hook because the client is the originator of that request and will have that information. So it can be FHIR data or references to FHIR data, but it's not always. And then every hook defines its own context. So prefetch data is always FHIR data. It's specific to a CDS service. So this is the CDS service advertising how or what data it needs. Note that clients are not required to honor prefetch requests from CDS services, but they should, and then expressed as FHIR read and search queries. Note it's a template, so look at this example, patient context.patient ID. The mustache syntax there is accessing context data from the hook. So that's saying, give me patient with the ID that's in the context of patient ID. So that way the service can say, I need this FHIR data and parameterize it with the current context. All right. And that can be any query. As you can see, that fire server capability statement is something you could actually ask for as prefetch. Oh, that came in. All right. All right, so why prefetch? So if your service always needs some data, if the first thing you're going to do as a service is call back and ask the EHR for this data, you might as well tell the EHR to provide that as part of the request. Efficiency, so EHRs may actually be able to consolidate duplicate prefetch into fewer requests or more optimal requests. And performance, so an EHR may actually be able to retrieve the data that you're asking for from its local context rather than going all the way to a call. There's less latency because you're not having to go back over the wire to make that request. So it's all about trying to get more performant access. Remember that CDS hook is happening in the workflow, so performance is key. All right. So status of CDS hooks, the priorities are a superlative clinical user experience. So performance, CDS improvement, ease of use. We're also currently validating the ordering hooks. Those are going through the HL7 validating process. So we're trying to get more implementation experience and review and content of those hooks. And also harmonization with CRD, that's coverage requirements discovery. So there's a bunch of implementations and implementation guides associated with prior authorization that we're working towards refinement and adoption. So in progress, there's also a potential drug-drug interaction project and the CDS hooks 1.1 publication, which is right around the corner. We just finished reconciliation on that. So things that went into 1.1, override reasons. So a clinician can override a card. Feedback service, so tell the CDS service what happened with a suggestion. That was formerly known as the analytics endpoint. And then refinements to CDS hooks response, so recommended and modular suggestions and card topics. So innovation around CDS hooks, a lot of this innovation is being driven by things like PAMA and system actions. So new CDS hooks capability drafted via Argonaut and tested during Connect-a-thons. And then those were balloted in CDS hooks 1.1, which would be published as an STU2. There's also nooks, crannies, sharp edges, and cliffs. So non-clinical guidance, so asynchronous cards, suggestions containing deferrable tasks. There are non-clinical hooks, so discussions around whether that kind of thing is possible with CDS hooks and what it looks like. So appointment book, for example, or encounter start. And then discussions around where the complexity lives for things like that. Is it in the CDS service or is it in the CDS client? There are configuration options extensions in both CRD and PDDI. We've looked at different potential ways of including those extensions in the specification in a more structured way. So looking at override reasons, this is an example of an override reason provided by the service as part of the response. So when the service returns the card, it can say, and here are possible reasons that the clinician could provide for overriding. If you're familiar with the FHIR codable concept, the structure is intentionally the same. This is part of the CDS hooks request response JSON, but that actual structure mimics a FHIR codable concept on purpose, so that that's as easy as possible to interoperate with. But you effectively define codes for the override reasons and return those as part of your response as a service. Then the EHR can display those. For example, in the public sandbox, if the service returns those overrides, then it will display this dismiss dropdown with those override reasons available. How are we on time? 15 minutes? Okay, we might get to questions quick. All right, so feedback service. Another aspect that was added was this feedback endpoint in 1.1. So in the current specification, there's no feedback. The service doesn't ever get any feedback about what the clinician actually did with the guidance that it returned. So that's kind of flying blind from a service perspective. And so actually being able to provide feedback about what the user did with those suggestions is an important piece. So that was added in 1.1. So just looking at that same example, but with feedback, again, we trigger the CDS hook, the service runs its rules, returns the card, but those cards now include an override reason. And that allows the client to actually return that feedback. So the feedback not only includes what the user did, but if they selected one of the override reasons. So those features kind of work together to enable the CDS service to get a better picture of how users are interacting with its responses. And then a card suggestion, several enhancements to kind of just cards overall were added. So is recommended. If you have multiple suggestions on a card, you can indicate that one of them is the recommended suggestion. So cards can have any number of suggestions, but each suggestion is kind of an or. And so you can indicate that it's the recommended approach of the options that you've provided. All right. So references, the specification is documented there. There is a CDS hook sandbox at that link, and the source code for the actual specification is in CDS hooks. There's also on the Zulip chat, there's a CDS hook stream that is quite active. And that's the CDS hooks repository. Okay, these are a few of the vendor systems that have implemented CDS hooks, at least in Connectathon, if not all the way to production. Many of those are production, and then those are some of the companies that have participated in various Connectathons in the development and refinement of CDS hooks. All right, so during DevDays, you can find and reach me here, bryn@04.com. There's a LinkedIn, and a Zulip chat, or in the speakers gallery. All right.
Can you turn on the question and answer microphone?
All right, we'll take questions now from the audience here.
Bryn, do you have a demo showing, the full steps, just showing us actual, requests and cards that you can show us?
Yeah. So if you go to sandbox.cdshooks.org, so that actually was a request response right there. It just happened. You can see that. So let me make that bigger. So this is mock EHR, kind of the simplest possible mock EHR. There's just a patient view, RX view, and PAMA imaging. Those are the different hooks. Patient view hook says when I open the patient's chart, which is basically what we just did in this mock EHR, then send the request to registered CDS services. So this would get out of the way. You can see what actually happened here in the request and response panels. So the request here, this client sent the patient ID, user ID practitioner, core practitioner 1. It sent prefetch data because the CDS service is a patient greeting service, and it says I need the patient resource in my request. So it's indicated on prefetch that it wants the patient, and so the client sent that patient as part of the request, and then the response came back, summary now seeing Daniel. So this card is what's actually getting rendered there. Yeah. In this sandbox, you can actually configure. You can add CDS services. So if you provide a CDS hooks discovery endpoint, then you can add services there. So, for example. I think that's it. I think we need that. It doesn't like that. There. So now the colorectal cancer screening CDS service that's on that endpoint is now in there as well. And it sent that request. This patient isn't configured for that, but you can also tell it which server you want to use. You can actually change the Fire server that this client will use. So does that help? And that, you can play with that and add services to it. So sandbox environment. Okay.
So for the CDS hook, how can you configure like multiple service providers? Is it possible to have?
Yeah, so the CDS client registers whatever services it knows about. So you, as a CDS client, you configure which services you call out, and it can be any number of endpoints. That's up to the client, right? The client would do that, yeah. If it had multiple services registered, yeah. So the service says what endpoints it has available on the discovery endpoint. That's what we just used there to pull back the services that are available on that. But then the client can, and that all usually happens out of band, right? It's not dynamic. The discovery endpoint is so to support dynamic eventually, where maybe a user could actually say, I want to pick this client and this service. But right now, that all of that registration happens out of band as part of integration.
Hi.
Hello.
I mean, a lot of this work sounds great. EHR vendors as supported CDS Hooks clients, it seems like there's still quite a lack of support. What strategies should we take in order to sort of improve that?
That's a great question. So it's some of the vendors have done a great job supporting CDS hooks and have gone really far and supported a lot of the hooks and a lot of the implementation. But you're right that there's not, broad adoption across all of the vendors. We worked to engage them to come to connectathons, to add support for CDS hooks to their products. But I think user demand is really the thing that will eventually drive it, right? That until the vendors hear clearly from their users that they want this feature, there's not really going to be drive. I guess unless it was mandated or something. That's another option, but that's sometimes not as effective either. So
I have a question on performance, because with a patient view hook, you mentioned the bilirubin example, but I can imagine there could be lots and lots of rules that in theory could apply to a patient when you open that chart. And so if you had 1,000 of these rules, wouldn't that put a performance burden on the system?
potentially. So that's part of why the integration is typically done out of band. Is the EHRs are very careful about that particular problem and making sure that when a patient view happens, it's not gonna bog down. There's also filtering. Most integration points have the ability to configure additional filters to decide whether or not a given service is appropriate on the client side before you even make the call. We've actually looked at putting that into the specification as well. It didn't make this 1.1, but that's on the list to do trigger guards. And then each service is obviously responsible for being as performant as possible as well. So it is a good point, but in practice, we haven't seen that as an issue.
Thanks, Bryn. So from medical device classification perspective, so we're covered on the data side probably with audit event, but then if I have to version the rules and have those audited, is there something which comes along with CDS hooks, or is it something which has to be implemented specifically by the application?
CDS hooks as the interface specification has enough information that you could track that and log it, but CDS hooks doesn't have anything specific about tracking which version of the rule was run on a particular service call.
Okay.
Because again, from CDS hooks perspective, it's a black box. It could be an AI, it could be specific rule, and so what the machinery of tracking what actually happens behind that isn't really part of the CDS hook specification.
Hi. First, I wanted to comment to that performance thing. Yes, I agree. It's an issue. With our current solution, all the 1,000 rules we have, it's like half a second. But then fetching the data takes a really long time. But I'm hoping that this prefetch templates will help a little bit in future for this issue. But then I had a question about the same case, the patient view. Many patients, they may have like 30 drugs and lots of diagnosis and lots of issues. And it wouldn't be very useful to have 20 separate cards for each drug interaction and 7 for all the renal issues the patient has. Have you thought of having, is there a possibility to have some visualization or tables or something within the card itself that would make it easy to make an sort of an overview of the situation of the patient, of the interactions, drug interactions, for example?
So the card itself, trying to think if I have that slide still. The content of the card, the body of the card, is marked down. You can put tables in Markdown. We've done tables with the opioid MME calculation, showing the different drugs that they're on and what their MME count is. We're looking at tables for urine tox screens over the past 6 months and showing columns for when there was positive results. So yeah, it is possible to put tables in, and the clients will render that, basically GitHub flavored Markdown. So
I have an additional question about fire versions and profiles. So my understanding at this point is that the client and the service provider have to be sort of in agreement beforehand what either core version plus profiles they are going to support, and the resources passed in by the trigger have to be the same that the rule uses. Is there a strategy for how to either make that agreement between client and server, or how do you approach that?
I don't want to say the wrong thing here. That was a ballot comment, and I'm just trying to remember if we actually put anything in the spec for that particular. So I'm going to go to the site, the build site, which is almost final 1.1. And I think that we put something into the discovery about version, but we might have, that came up and I don't remember what the resolution was. I believe it was so we have this usage requirements, which is basically basically sidestepping the issue, right? So we're saying, yes, there's lots of complexity there, but we don't think we know what the answer looks like formally yet. And so we've added this usage requirements that allows the service to say, I'm Fire 4 and I expose US core profiles or whatever. Because yeah, a lot of that happens out of band right now. And we didn't feel like we had enough formal experience to put that in, to say, yes, I'm version 4 and I expose these profiles. So that's the answer. Does that help?
Are there any questions in the room?
We have time for maybe one question then. Let's see. This is from the from Hoover app. How would offline integration make a difference for performance when you don't know what will trigger for each patient? How much data will tag as needed to flow back and forth, et cetera? That's going to vary a lot.
That is going to vary a lot. I mean, the best we can do is try to make sure that the prefetch gives as much information about what data the service needs as possible. I think that's the knob that's available to tweak that. If the service describes in as much detail as possible the prefetch requirements, then that can help with that.
So maybe we can squeeze in one more. Can you please unpack what you mean by nooks and crannies, sharp edges and cliffs? That wasn't really explained. Are you talking about supported items that you wish there were, or things that are being worked on?
These are discussions that are in progress. If you go to the CDS Hooks stream, you can see a lot of this discussion happening, and please do participate in that discussion. So that's the nooks and crannies. These are things that are currently being worked out. Some of them have made it into the spec as proposals, like appointment book and encounter start are proposed hooks that are currently being worked out. But these are the discussions that are currently taking place. Does that help?
Well, it's from the internet, so if there's further questions, you can ask on Hoover. Bryn will answer any questions on Hoover, and that's about time. So thank you very much, Bryn.